Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is an award-winning leader and executive coach who utilizes his deep understanding of positive psychology and Buddhist philosophy to encourage personal and organizational growth. In addition to coaching, he has taught meditation techniques for more than a decade and regularly leads expeditions to destinations including Bhutan, Mongolia, Nepal, Thailand, and Tibet. He holds a BA in psychology, an MA in comparative religion, and a PhD in Buddhist philosophy. He is the author of the new book, Shift, The Art of Transforming Limitations. Welcome to the show, Nick Egan.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
Yeah, man. So excited to have you on the show. I love your background. We have similar curiosities. I love that you have a PhD in Buddhism. So there's so many things that we can talk about, and you're exploring and traveling. And I got a chance to look over your book. It looks very concise. You know, when somebody's able to kind of take these concepts that can be a little bit confusing and make them very concise, I could read that in your writing right away. So obviously you have experience, you know what you're talking about. So why don't we just begin by giving the audience a little bit of knowledge about your background, what you've been up to, and how you got to writing the book and everything you're doing now.
Yeah. So I started off pretty young, interested in meditation and spirituality. And when I was 16 and able to drive, I started driving around to these different meditation centers. And I settled on a great Zen temple here in Sonoma County, Sonoma Mountain Zen Center. And so I started practicing with them for a couple of years, pretty intensively. And after about year 3, maybe 4, I got interested a little bit more on the Tibetan side of things. And that was for 2 reasons. One, I'm inclined to enjoy debate and arguing and philosophy and all of that. And in the Tibetan tradition, that's really, really emphasized within certain schools. And then the other piece was energy work. So I was simultaneously also doing martial arts, which I know you have a background in as well. And so the energy piece really appealed to me. And in Zen, at least the kind of Zen that I was practicing, Soto Zen, it wasn't emphasized in the same way that it is in the Tibetan tradition. So I migrated over to the Tibetan tradition slowly, found a couple of really good teachers, and just started practicing and training for quite a while. I guess it's coming up on over 20 years now. And through that, I also simultaneously was studying psychology in undergrad. And I got a bit disillusioned because at the time, my program at least was really focusing on helping people heal emotional wounds, which is fantastic. But I was really interested in how, the deeper layers of mind that might allow people to thrive or to go beyond what's considered, ordinary reality. And so by the time I was done with that, I decided, well, I'm going to not go for the therapy license. And instead, I'm going to discover what, comparative religion and philosophy has to offer. And so then I went through that time. And then as part of my PhD program, I went and stayed in a monastery in Nepal and studied Tibetan philosophy and language.
That's amazing. So how long did you stay in Nepal? I only had a brief time there. It was about 6 weeks, and that's when I ended up trekking Mount Everest. And I was teaching English in the morning and then having conversations about Buddhism at night. And so I'm curious how long you stayed there and what you learned. For me, it was very fascinating. I learned a lot about Buddhism, but also one of the really interesting things that I heard was that these Buddhists, the older ones, were translating these ancient Buddhist texts, and it said now it's time for the rest of the world to learn this ancient wisdom. And that's why this particular monastery was studying English and they were translating all these ancient texts. So I'm curious what your experience was like.
Yeah, so I went to Nepal when I was 18 for a few weeks, and then I went back again. I had been there a few times for about a month or so. And then so when I went to go study in the monastery, it was about, I think it was just shy of 8 months, something around that time. Man, I'll tell you, just eating that food, I lost a lot of weight. I'm a relatively skinny guy to begin with, and I didn't realize how malnourished I was until I got home and my mom, started crying. I think I lost 30 pounds, which I did not have that to spare. So yeah, my experience there was amazing. I mean, I think you're immersed in this culture that is sort of at the crossroads between India, Tibet, and then kind of shamanistic tendencies in the East. And it's really, it's like no place else in Asia in terms of the culture and the richness of spirituality that's there. And certainly there is this idea within the Tibetan Buddhist community that now is the time to kind of spread these teachings that were previously held fairly tightly within Tibet. And so you can, I mean, I joke around now, I live in California in the Bay Area, and, you know, you can find advanced Dharma teachings down in Oakland and Berkeley that you can't get anywhere in Tibet these days. So it really is interesting to see the flourishing of the Dharma in the West.
That's fascinating. So, well, let's dive into a little bit about your book, because
Mhm.
it's very concise. You know, I'll read some of the chapters because I think they're great topics. But transform your story, reclaim your limitless potential,
Mhm.
transform fixation, go beyond
Mhm.
definitions, transform difficulty, obstacles are opportunities, which is a very powerful perspective to have.
Mhm.
Transform urgency, identify your priority, and eliminate panic. I'm just going to read all of them because they're all great. Transform attachment, let go of the useless and discover space for the useful. Transform impatience, discover the benefits of frustration, which I definitely want you to talk about because I'm constantly frustrated. And transform the ordinary, discover the extraordinary in everyday moments. All really amazing topics. So do you want to
Mhm.
dive into any of those? Maybe the ones that most commonly come up when you're either teaching or working with people,
Mhm.
or working with businesses, and yeah, whatever you want to start with.
Yeah, so it's funny because I've been trying to write the book for a long time, and even though I do have permission to teach Buddhism in a certain way, I didn't really feel comfortable creating a Buddhist book. I mean, there are plenty of amazing teachers out there that have these books that are phenomenal, you know, at lots of different levels, both beginner to very advanced. And so I kept hitting this roadblock until I gave myself permission one day to say, you know, what if I don't write a Buddhist book, but instead write a book for anybody and everybody that happens to also lean on my background within Buddhism and within psychology and within organizational psychology in particular. So that's when it really started to flow. So it's funny, yes, I draw a lot on the Buddhist tradition, but my hope is that anybody can pick it up and use it, whether you have some connection to the tradition or not. Because it really is about personal development, not necessarily enlightenment as such. Although I think taken to the extreme, you can understand a little bit more about how to get there. So anyway, yeah, just going to just the patience part. I mean, reframing tolerance and patience, and in the face of an obstacle like a challenge or an annoyance, or it could be either a situation or a person, right? And so we think about these things as something to avoid, but actually those are the very things that we need to train. And so an analogy that I often use with my clients is that you go to the gym and there are heavy weights, and you want to choose progressively heavier weights in order to get stronger. And when you're doing it right, it doesn't feel pleasurable. I mean, you can learn to enjoy it, right? You can learn to feel the burn and enjoy that. But at the first go, it's like, oh, this kind of hurts. And then you're sore afterwards. But then you go toward that again and again and again. And that we never get mad at the weights for being heavy, right? But we walk around in our daily life and we are mad at like the situation or the person that's bothering us. But if we look at it as like a spiritual training ground, or even just a psychological training ground, then it can become actually quite pleasurable, and you can learn to appreciate the growth that comes with the quote unquote burn.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective. And one perspective I also enjoy, I learned from one of my teachers, David Lombear, was I was getting upset at some sort of problem. And he's like, well, he's just like, rather than thinking of it as a problem, think of it as a puzzle. And I was like, And it
Mm-hmm.
seems that life is just constant puzzles from the beginning right to the very end. There's always going to be something new that we're trying to solve because you're always growing. We're always having new experiences. And when it is a constant, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
thing in Zen, they'll talk about life as suffering. Alan
Mm-hmm.
Watts says more accurately, he believes life is frustrating. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we know that this is a constant thing, you're going to wake up and there's going to be something that is going to frustrate you, that's going to make you upset, and you're aware of that. You can transform or change your perspective and how you're going to deal with that situation when you know for sure it's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen. And I think that that's when it leads into more power and more free will, because it's not your external circumstances dictating how you feel and how you experience life. Want to
Yeah.
comment on any of that?
No, I think that's exactly right. So you were describing it as like power and freedom. So you have a greater degree of freedom to be able to choose how you want to respond to these situations rather than having it be kind of a reflexive knee-jerk reaction. And I'll say, in my experience, to do this, what we're talking about successfully, you actually need two things. The first is understanding like a framework. So either you're looking at it as like, this is the gem of life, or like you were saying, this is just a puzzle to unlock, something like that, like a positive framework that allows you to move beyond just this moment of frustration. And then what I've found is that a lot of my clients are able to do that intellectually, but then when you're, excuse me, when you're in the moment, it's quite hard to remain cool, calm, and collected to be able to actually do those things. And that's where a practice like meditation comes in. Because if you're good at either, mindfulness or meditation or whatever it is, and you have that practice that you've been doing daily, for weeks and months and years, that gives you the opportunity, the space to be able to do those things. It's kind of like martial arts, right? You can learn all the techniques you want, but if you don't have the power to be able to execute them, they're kind of useless. And so the power pieces of the meditation or the mindfulness, and then the techniques are the framing around it, the positive framing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really great point. I was listening to a really great podcast today, Finding Mastery, and he was speaking with Mark Devine from Unbeatable Mind. He's a former Navy SEAL, and was just talking about these different frames of how, he's like, some people, when I'm training them, they have trouble meditating. So one of the ways that he'll do it is he'll exhaust the body. And that's the martial arts part. Is like, once the body's exhausted, the mind has nowhere to go because it can only focus on the pain and just getting through that next step or that next experience. It can't be thinking about sandwiches and all your stresses and things going on because you've got the body. So there are different ways, but he also shared the importance that you have to be doing that some sort of training, to make that perspective work, to make that mindset work, because many people are looking at philosophy, Zen, Buddhism, meditation, mindfulness, just from a logical perspective, but that's kind of the mind we're trying to influence in a way, and you almost have to step out of that. And these practices allow you to step out of that to see a different frame, because otherwise you're just stuck in it. And I'm really curious about the chapter in Reclaim Your Limitless Potential. Can you describe that chapter, like in what you're trying to share with that and what the teaching is?
Sure. Yeah. First, I want to go back to something you said about like really tiring out the body to allow the mind to kind of settle down. It really reminds me of my first Zen teacher. He used to say, you need to get steamrolled. And the way that he was meant steamrolled was, you don't meditate for 5 minutes here, 20 minutes there, every other day or whatever. It was like, you sit down, you meditate. We're going to meditate for 4 hours straight, not moving. Or like an entire day, you're going to meditate 15 hours in this day and then go to sleep and do it again. And then it's like, that's a way, it sounds, I think, painful or maybe impossible to a lot of beginners, but even for a beginner, if you do that, just hold the space for that. It's possible to make a lot of progress very, very quickly. And it's just, you have to like steamroll the mind. And so I think that some of the problem with people's experience around this is just not diving into it deeply enough. We're so afraid of a little bit of discomfort, both mentally and physically, that it can really hinder us for sure. So anyway,
well, yeah, I was gonna add on to that too. I was just I take notes as we go along, but it's such a great concept, and it's something that I absolutely learned through martial arts. It's going towards discomfort, and I'm no expert at it. I know people like David Goggins and the Navy SEALs and what other people have done. I just heard this documentary, The Iron Cowboy. I forget his name. It's on Netflix, but this guy, holy shit! I just found out did a marathon every day for 50 days in 50 states. Is unbelievable.
That's crazy.
Wait, no, not a marathon. Imagine. Sorry. Way worse than that. A triathlon. So including a marathon, you know what I mean? It was just, at the beginning, I was like, is this even possible? Like, what? Yeah. And he does it. And then we've got the guy who just did the 2-hour marathon. And I was wondering what the pace is. It's 13 miles an hour for 2 hours. Most runners can only do it for about a minute, so right. I'm going to go and try and see how long I can do it. But it's unbelievable. And I love that concept because it's something that when I trained in China with the Shaolin monks, that was basically their training. If you want to boil it down to the most rudimentary thing that they did to everybody was that they steamrolled us physically, so, those hard sits of meditation. And it's really challenging to do it on your own without an outside guide. But
Mhm.
when you can do it on your own, I don't know how to put words around it
Mhm.
in only to say that it's so beneficial and it cultivates a mental strength moving towards that discomfort. And, David Goggins is a guy who takes it to the extreme, and but martial artists in China and many around the world, they're able to do it themselves. And even if they do it a little bit, but being able to, of your own free will and volition, push
Mhm.
yourself
Right.
to discomfort beyond that limit that you think it is. And there's so much value in that. I don't know how to describe it, but your point is very valid.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too. So when you talk about the physical disciplines, that's sort of easy to see. Like everybody can see, oh my gosh, so this guy did, triathlons every day for however many days, 50 days. That you can measure. And I think now we're just coming to the point where the scientific instrumentation is such that we can actually see what's the equivalent of that in terms of meditation. People that meditate 3 years in retreat, 10 years in retreat, things like that. Like how do we see that? And I think that's what's so interesting about living in this time right now, is that 10, 15, 20 years ago, we weren't able to measure that. And now we are, and it's blowing scientists' minds. And it's like, wow, this guy's brain is actually physically different. It's like, yeah, of course. If you meditate in a cave for 10 years, what else did you expect? But that's kind of news on the scientific front. So I think it's an exciting time because, yes, everybody's looking for a shortcut and a hack and all of that. But, the scientific method is quite valuable. And once it's applied to the spiritual, I think it actually can be a very beneficial tool to kind of jump things up to the next level.
Yeah, man, 100%. I totally agree. And that's, for me, writing Zen Athlete, and the hope there
Mm-hmm.
was like sharing the, the mindset tools that
Mm-hmm.
all of the greatest athletes have talked about and martial artists have been doing for decades,
Mm-hmm.
making it simple. But the challenge is when you go to the gym, your body hurts. And so
Mm-hmm.
to convince people that visualization works, that
Mm-hmm.
understanding your internal dialogue works, but this is the stuff that transforms your life, and you don't need to be an athlete. But these are simple tools that people have been talking about forever. So again, it's a really great point. They're simple ideas, but sometimes tough to execute or feel. It's like when I was younger, like you, meditating and looking at all this stuff, it's not a physical thing, right? But it
Mm-hmm.
was like kind of this feeling. And that's kind of when you get into spirituality and nature. And I just did a little getaway with my girlfriend, and I talk about these stories that, I was like, well, trying to discern, like, what the hell am I actually doing with the podcast? And I was like, part of the thing that I attempt to do is share with people that there is some sort of universal force out there that's beyond our
Mm-hmm.
understanding. And I have
Mm-hmm.
experienced it directly several times. And she told me this story about when she was younger. She's like, I know what you're talking about. And was talking about, she had a decision in her life to make. And she's like, if it's yes, I'd like red roses, right? And if it's no, I would like dead roses. So
Mm-hmm.
roses and then dead roses. And so she said she'd been doing that for about a week or so, and then all of a sudden just let it go. And a part of like the manifestation process, if I've heard anyways, like you got to do it with like non-attachment. So when you're finally
Right.
like, okay, I'm going to let it go, which is way harder done than said. She said she come downstairs at her friend's house, and somebody said, where did these roses come from? And there were dead roses on the table, and nobody had known where they had come from. And they were at the house, and she's like, we were all there. There was no one else home. You know what I mean? We
Yeah.
had been downstairs a few minutes before. Where did these things come from? And it's just like, something very strange that you've been asking for specifically. So working with this like universal intangible force. So I guess with that rant, please feel free to add on anything you want to it. And what do you believe about that universal force, God? Studying religions, right? Everybody's trying to get to God, but they have it in different ways. And going to the Parliament of World
Right.
Religions, I saw good and bad, and
Mm-hmm.
have different thoughts on that. So what's your view?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm reading a book right now talking about law of attraction and manifestation and all of that. And it's been a while. I used to read those books quite often when I was much younger. And once I got into more orthodox kind of Buddhist philosophy, I put those aside, not because I didn't believe in them or because they didn't jive with anything, but I was just a little bit more focused on that side of things. And it's interesting to me because one, I mean, I certainly have some experiences where there's no question in my mind that what you put out there in terms of your intention, what you're holding in as reality or what you're asking for, it's going to get to you eventually. It's just there are a couple of factors, like how often do you do it? How strong do you do it? How clear is your mind? kind of what actions have lined up to make that happen. And we can talk about that in Buddhism as almost karma, right? People think of karma as this very almost like infantile, like, oh, I'm doing one good thing and that goes in my bank of karma, and then eventually I'm going to get this other good thing from it. That's actually, it's not wrong, but it's a very low level understanding of karma. A better way is that actually my experience of the entire universe is only a projection of consciousness. We can call it like consciousness only. So it's coming from the Chittamatra school, which means literally mind only. And because of that, it's much more malleable than we think it is. And if we have clarity of intention and feeling, we can actually create things that were not there previously, or create new situations for us to experience. And the tactical implication for this is that within Buddhism, specifically Tibetan Buddhism, the highest meditations are not simply sitting and breathing. They're actually visualizing yourself as a Buddha or as an enlightened being. You know, all the colors and lights and all those mandalas that we see everywhere, those are actually the floor plans for like an enlightened world. And so when you're doing this practice and you're saying these mantras, you're connecting up with that enlightened energy and you're visualizing it, you're bringing it forth. And what they say is that that's the fastest path to enlightenment. Why? Because you're actually manifesting what you truly are deep within. So that is very similar to what many people are talking about within law of attraction. A little bit different. The difference is that I think Buddhism is mostly geared obviously toward enlightenment, right? Whatever that might mean to somebody. Whereas law of attraction, I think they use it a little bit more to gain what would be considered like worldly success. But there's room for that as well, you know.
I love that. Got me taking notes again. Everything you're saying, I gotta take these notes. Well, no now I want to go like a different way with it because we're kind of getting there. So you spend time in Nepal, and when I was in Nepal, I trekked Mount Everest. I tried to go to Tibet, but I did not know it's still occupied by China, still occupied to this day. So to go there, you got to go with, it's ridiculous what they make you do. It's an unacceptable situation that's still going on now. Just an FYI, it's baloney, but I wanted to go there. Couldn't do it. So was in Nepal, trekked Mount Everest, and on the way up to Mount Everest, I look, and it's like 3 days up, and I look across the Himalayas in the middle of winter, and there is a massive temple on the other side. And I asked my guides, I was like, who the heck is over there? How do you even get there? And they're like, we don't know. I was like, what do you mean? I was like, I was like, how on God's green earth do you get over there? And so it makes me think about, part of the reason to go to Nepal and Tibet and China, I've been very curious about ascended masters or enlightenment in the sense of like what Jesus could apparently do, which I think that he existed, what Buddha was able to do, as far as like enlightenment. And then also most recently, Yogananda, I'm talking about the Babaji lineage and people like that. And so where I'm at with it right now is that I think that those people exist. Even in the indigenous cultures, learning from Native Americans, they kind of talk about certain people that had these powers. Now, I kind of have two minds about it now. Number one is that I feel like enlightenment was a lot simpler than I thought, that I don't know if I'm going to get to a consciousness where I'm like, I am Christ consciousness and everything is hunky dory and I'm floating around on a cloud and it's all perfect. What I kind of feel at this point around enlightenment, it's more about, making decisions with integrity, understanding who you are, walking the path each and every day, doing something of meaning and more like less fancy. That being said, I do think that maybe that consciousness is possible and that there are beings and people that exist now or in the past that have experienced them. So they can do like, obviously if you've read Autobiography of a Yogi, right?
Yeah.
So part of the, those teachers doing those wild things. So did you, when you were in Nepal, ever experience or hear of anyone like that? Or what are your thoughts around that field of people, whether it's like Jesus and studying comparative religions, you have different people that can do certain things. So what are your thoughts on all of that? And also God in particular?
Yeah,
I just got to throw the bus at you.
I was like, what are your thoughts on everything and this other thing?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, okay. A lot of great stuff in there. First, I would say that just thinking about, power, like we call it occult powers or supernatural powers. There's certainly at least in the Buddhist tradition and in my own experience, there are many, many people that have varying degrees of that. And even I think, quote unquote, ordinary people many people that I know have had experiences like your girlfriend's experience. That would be considered almost like a power type of thing. In Sanskrit, it's called a siddhi, like an accomplishment. Siddhi. So I'm a huge believer in those kind of things, both from experience and from just on the philosophical side. Now, the challenge is that's not exactly the same as enlightenment. So I actually trained with a guy, a meditator in a different Western tradition. And the guy, I mean, there's no question he had some significant abilities, clairvoyant abilities. He had proven to me many, many times. But he was still, sort of a jerk. And he didn't really the deeper levels of enlightenment, I think, were not there just because that's not what he was training. So those two things are not necessarily the same thing. And even within kind of the classical Tibetan tradition, they'll say, the worldly accomplishments, meaning like powers, supernatural powers, and enlightenment, the otherworldly accomplishment, are not the same thing. So it's important not to confuse the two. Doesn't mean one's better than, well, it does actually mean it doesn't mean you need to disparage one or the other. It just means that they're separate. So when you talk about, so I'm getting to your point about like, what is enlightenment, and is it like consciousness floating on a cloud and that sort of thing? In Buddhist philosophy, there are actually two kinds of enlightenment. We can call it like an enlightenment of a place. So like enlightenment, and this is considered, at least in the Tibetan tradition, the lower level. It's where it's like, okay, I go to nirvana, and I'm kind of like what you're saying, like floating on a cloud. There's no more pain, none of that. So I'm going to a place, so a localized nirvana. The other enlightenment, the other kind of nirvana, is a non-localized nirvana. And what they say is that it's like you recognize the nature of mind, and you stabilize that so much to where you can walk around, and it doesn't matter if you're in heaven, hell, the Bronx, Calgary, San Francisco, wherever, it's all nirvana. And I definitely have had experiences with teachers where they will say this. In fact, my first Zen teacher, it's funny, even though I only studied Zen rigorously 3 years, it's definitely coming up in this conversation. I one time asked him the exact same question. And what I was struggling with was like, okay, when you die, this Roshi dies, are you going to come back as a reincarnated bodhisattva, somebody that comes back and helps people? Or are you going to go up to a Pure Land or a Nirvana, something like that? Like, what's the deal with that? And so I asked him this, this young punk 19-year-old kid, like what an idiot I was, right? And he looked at me and he said with his deep voice, he said, "This is Nirvana." And there was no doubt in my mind that was his experience. So then if that's the case, so if we take that at base level, the question is, why are we screwing up Nirvana? And how do we stop doing that? Right? And so then it becomes like, okay, how do I sharpen my awareness so much so that every moment I really experience the infinite nature of both myself and of all reality? And it's possible. And all it takes is one glimpse. So if you can get one glimpse of that through meditation, then it's like, okay, it may take you 100 years or 100 lifetimes. But if you have just one glimpse, you know what that feels like, and you can kind of start moving toward it. And all the better if you have a teacher. Now, you asked, the final thing you were talking about was God. What's up with God? And like my personal beliefs, and also kind of the Buddhist beliefs in general. Within the Tibetan school, and I would say most elements of Mahayana Buddhism, meaning the northern part of Buddhism that you find in China, Japan, there's an understanding that they talk about emptiness, right? Like, oh, emptiness or nothingness or voidness. Sometimes it gets translated as shunyata, is the Sanskrit term. And what that means is that it's empty of limitation. It doesn't mean there's like nothing there. It just means it's interconnected with everything else. And so when you get every little bit of something interconnected with every little bit of everything else throughout all the vast universe, or universe is, whatever it counts as that, what you get is there really is no birth and no death ultimately. And instead, it's like almost like a universal divine energy. And in fact, in Sanskrit, the word would be deva, which means like, you could translate it as God, but it actually just means divine, D-E-V-A, deva. And like everything is deva, like that, which is so if you're talking about God, it's not so much that there's a creator God that's separate from, it's that everything is God itself. And the analogy that I like to give is, it's like the entire world, everything would be made out of gold. And some things that are made out of gold are beautiful. And other things that are made out of gold are like murder weapons or whatever, or ugly things. But actually at its essence, it's all gold. And so we forget that. Instead, what we get stuck in is the manifestation, meaning like, oh, that's a nice gold pot, or, oh, that's a terrible, ugly gold sculpture, something like that. But actually, at its fundamental level, it's all gold. And at the fundamental level of experience, it's all divine, meaning all God.
Awesome, man. Those are really amazing explanations of very challenging and deep questions. So beautiful answers. There's a lot that I'm curious about in what you've said and just in general, but I'm trying to decide which way I want to go with it. What will
Yeah,
be the most useful? Because my brain is going all kinds of different directions.
sure.
Okay, so I guess what I'll start with is, oh yeah, I wanted to mention this. You know, you said a lot of things that I agree with. In Yogananda, he wrote a very small book called Scientific Affirmations, and he talked
Mm.
about why you are trying to manifest something, but it doesn't work. Why you're using
Oh.
affirmations and they don't work. And essentially what he's saying is you're not adding any spiritual will. And so he talks
Mm.
about like these methods being scientific and that the universe is electromagnetic and you need to put a force to it. And it's so
Mhm.
you're wanting this thing that you're affirming and you're asking the universe for, but you're putting no will towards it. So it's like if you are this empty pond, you know, you'd be putting like 1 ounce, maybe like, I want
Mhm.
this ideal lover or I want this ideal job, and you just say it, but there's no actual energy or emotion, which could be, you know, Dr. Joe Dispenza's work. He says your emotion is the magnetic charge and your thoughts are the electric charge to the quantum universe, or
Oh,
however explains that.
interesting.
Very,
Yeah.
very interesting stuff. Yeah. So when so what he's suggesting is that you need to put that will in there. And the example that I use is we're going around talking about these affirmations, and the same with you know, sports and visualization and manifesting whatever the heck you want. There's no emotion. So it's like if you want to learn how to do a backflip before you've done one, the more real you can make it and the more excited you are when you land it, the more likely you're going to have it. The more real you can make that affirmation of the love or whatever. So it's like we put an ounce in, it's like, oh, you know, like I'd like my ideal job, or I am living my ideal life, or whatever. But if
Mhm.
you take the example of a mother whose child is like under a car and it's burning, and she
Yeah.
like this, there's documented cases of this. The mother lifts up the car. She's not worried about how much she squats. She's not worried about how strong she is. She is just putting every ounce of her will, of her being, of her essence into making that thing move to
Mhm.
save the daughter. So can you imagine if we had our affirmations and our goals and our desires and we put that amount versus the little piddles that we do when we say an affirmation? And it kind of leads to the point when you're talking about these spiritual powers or the manifestation powers. When you're doing it just to manifest, let's say you want to manifest materialism, money is fine. We need money to survive. You can do that. But if you're just manifesting cars and money and houses for
Mhm.
the sake of them, and another house and another house, it's not going to lead to really permanent fulfillment. That's the
Mhm.
idea. You know what I mean? Those things are great to share, but there's more than just the material thing. So you can manifest money.
Mhm.
There's no problem with that. But the idea is that it's not about the spiritual powers. It's not about the money. It's not about like, oh, look at me, I can do these things. There's this deeper thing. And then it becomes philanthropic. You want to use what you've learned and how you feel and what you can do with your life to support and share with other people. And we discussed earlier, like the Enlightenment, one of the things I feel like a modern enlightened person isn't always thinking about what I can get. You know, what can I get? Yeah, we need to get things, and that's okay. Like, I'd like to get this for the house, this for my daughter, this for this. You can do that, but it's more like, what can I give back? How can I support community? How can I support my neighbors? How can I support the world? What can I do that can help another being? They have that as more of their true nature, you know. And I found that in Buddhism a lot too. It was about so much about service. So I'm going to shut up and see if you want to add anything onto those
Yeah.
comments.
No, that's great. No, I agree with that. I think kind of working backwards. So the idea of enlightenment, there's something called bodhicitta. So it's Sanskrit, another Sanskrit term. Bodhi means enlightenment. So it's similar to like a bodhisattva, an enlightened being, or a Buddha. Actually, those words are related. And chitta it means heart or mind. And so it's like your consciousness, and it's like an enlightened heart or an enlightened mind. It gets translated like that. And the very first level of it has deepening levels of meaning, right? But the very first level is actually just wishing everybody to become the most happy they possibly can. And within a Buddhist formulation, that's like enlightenment. So that means at a very concrete level, having a warm heart toward as many people as you can and wishing them the highest level of happiness. So that is a form of enlightenment that people, I mean, it's not terribly mystical, but there is something amazingly valuable and beneficial about it. And if you don't start with that foundation, it becomes very easy to get caught up in some of the other kind of more fancy, quote unquote, spiritual things. And I do think that you see people that fall into that trap. You know, they're really good at like Reiki or whatever it is, but actually they're kind of not the most kind-hearted people. And the Dalai Lama, he's the great emissary of this. This is what he talks about, you know, all the time, is this bodhicitta thing, the kind heart. So I think you're right about that. And I think that going more to what you were saying, like the manifestation as a form of scientific understanding, I think that's actually true. And I think a lot of these traditions, like I'm thinking of Taoism, so spiritual practices that came out of China, and then Buddhism and Hinduism, spiritual practices that came out of India and migrated to Tibet and other places. They merged with elements of the medical tradition, right? So like the whole idea of chi or prana, that actually came out of the medical tradition of these places. So there is the scientific element, and through years of like experimentation and also insight, they were able to create these systems that are incredibly powerful, right? And so I think that there isn't anything like in the West, we have this thing of like, oh, faith and science, you know, forget it, because faith in the West means you have to take it on blind faith. Don't question. If you question too much, you know, you can't understand it, all this stuff. Faith in India actually means understanding something logically and then having an experience of it. So you can translate faith, the word in Tibetan is depa. You can translate that as confidence, because it doesn't, you know, anybody can, if I've had an experience of something, you can't really shake my confidence in that way. So now going to the manifestation piece, putting spiritual energy behind something, it's funny because one way to look at the world from an Asian kind of spiritual perspective is that everything is energy, but just like varying degrees of intensity, right? So on the one hand, you have the physical universe, which is a kind of energy. Inside the body, there's like chi or prana, actual like bio energy. And that chi or that prana, that energy that moves through you, as it's hitting certain spots, it can create what we call emotion. And so that actually is what emotion is. And we have that in English too, like emotion, energy in motion. And so it's moving through the body and it's creating these emotions. And at the most subtle level is consciousness. And I'm saying consciousness very intentionally because it's, yes, mind, ordinary thinking mind. Like if I think I need a cup of tea or something, that is consciousness. But there's an even deeper substrate of consciousness. And because of that, you can tap into, I think, a greater degree of clarity, force, and freedom. And if you put that behind your manifestation, there's absolutely no stopping it. And if you get really, really good, I mean, this is like high level. They say it's like instantaneous, right? I mean, for us, we have to, even in ordinary time, if I'm thinking about tea and I'm like, oh, I really want tea. And like, oh, I really want it enough to where I have to get up and go make the tea. That is a form of manifestation. I have that emotional need, and then I want to go, I have a thought, and then I put forth action, and then here it is. But for somebody that's like very, very, very advanced, you can just do the same thing, but it's like, bam, tea is there because their mind is so clear. Now it's the same thing of like, that sounds like a little bit out there. But if you think about like these guys that are lifting, you know, an Olympic lifter or something, or the Ironman guy, like it took years of practice to get to that point. They didn't just walk up and be like, you know, lift this 800-pound bar or whatever it is. Like if I tried that, I couldn't budge at all. And I'd be like, that's impossible. I don't believe it. But actually through specific kind of training, it is possible.
Yeah, man, I agree with all that. And that's a really brilliant analogy, because what has been happening on the planet, when you look at the physical attributes, we can see that and measure it. And the 2-mile marathon it's ridiculous. I don't care as to, it is impossible. The 50 triathlons in a day, that is an impossible thing. Like it really is. It's unbelievable. You know, even stuff that Wim Hof was doing and measuring and just being in cold and what our bodies are capable of. But all of this stuff was done through training. And I had heard of somebody that I met, I actually wrote about in my book. And I actually recently, I hadn't thought about him forever, but a person that had meditated for, well, I'll tell the story briefly because I'm into it, but it's somebody that I met. And when I when I was doing my first ayahuasca ceremony years ago. And he just, every time we did a podlock, and every time he would say something, this guy just had knowledge, you know what I mean? You could just tell. So I got up to him and was like, hey, Tyrone, like, you mind if we like grab a coffee sometime? I'd love to just chat with you, because you know what's going on. So we were chatting, and I was like, and I discover, and I was like, well, how did you come to like this awareness? And it was profound, you know, everything he was saying was so deep. And he goes, well, he's like, I've been kind of like spiritual and seeking my whole life, been curious about, you know, meditation and consciousness and God. He's like, in my 30s, I like a few years ago, I wanted to really know. So I started to read books, and I read over 300 books in a year, or 400 books in a year, and every religious book, every spiritual book, every enlightened book I read. That's all I did for the whole year, and I didn't figure it out. And he goes, so I go, at that point, I was like, the next step was I had the idea that I was going to stay in meditation for the rest of my life until I knew, and I wasn't going out. And he looked at me and he goes, you can't fake that. I was never coming out until I knew. And I was like, okay. I was like, so then what did you do? And he goes, well, I started meditating. And I was like, how long for it? He's just like 20 hours a day. I was like, oh my God. I was like, what did you eat? And he goes, my brother would drop off food, just rice and vegetables every couple of weeks. And I'd wake up and, you know, eat those rice and vegetables and go back to meditating. And he goes, it just so happened to be about 100 days. And he's just like, I was never coming out. He's like, you can't fake. And I've heard like it talks about it in spiritual texts and in the Bible and things like that. It's like asking, it is given. It's like the yearning for like spirit, God, or the universe in a very honest way. And that's why, you know, I don't agree with most religions. I have like, if you're a religious person, I got no problem with that. You can be religious. I have a challenge with the institutions battling each other and killing each other because they believe different things about what I perceive as the same idea, the same goal, you know. So that's the challenge that I have. But what I love about a lot of religious people, and I have a lot of religious friends, and they're great. I wouldn't say a lot, but I have some. They have that thing. They have that direct faith to the higher power. And I think that's so wonderful that most people don't have. But I just don't, you know, it's just the individual stories. And I've been having like weekly conversations with Jehovah's Witness, you know, but I was like, it's just like this, you just have this one story and you can't see anyone else's point of view, you know, and that's where I get squirrely. But that faith that they have to that higher power, that honest yearning, and so that's what Tyrone did. And he wasn't coming out until he had it. And he said, just so happened to be 100 days. I felt like I was getting electrocuted, and I didn't know if water had leaked in and I was actually being electrocuted because I've been meditating for so long. So I just surrendered to it. And then you've had the experience and I've had it too. It's kind of like oneness mind or non-local mind or whatever. It's indescribable. So he described it in a few certain ways. And, you know, oh yeah. And so as this guy is talking to me, man, I had put my hands underneath my seat because my body was floating up, but I wasn't registering what was happening. It felt like I was coming out of my body. And I was like, what the heck? I tell him to take a break. I have to go pee. I go into the bathroom. I go pee. My face is moving. It's like I'm on psychedelics, and I'm just like, what in the flying bejesus is happening right now? Like, this is so mental. And it's funny because two of my buddies, so I could get on the podcast and talk about it, we had that same experience together 2 weeks previous. We were talking about all these spiritual concepts, and we had like a spiritual experience. And one of my buddies made a comment, and we're like, I'm just a weird human, so I thought I was going through it by myself, but they actually had it too. And so I had it with this individual person. It's a long-winded way to say that he shared an example after that about how he'd come through. And I was like, well, he talked about a thing that he was able to manifest pretty instantly around finances. And he's like, I have a lot of money, but it was something that I could measure. You know, he had money from doing other stuff before. He's like, that wasn't the issue, but I wanted to do something that I couldn't measure. So very long-winded way to say, but when we want to manifest something, the first problem that I see in law of attraction is it's just material. We need material stuff, yes, but where we're going, how we want to shape, who we want to be, what we want to learn, how we want to grow, how we want to give back goes far beyond just the material. Material is one part of it that is welcomed and necessary, but not the most important. It's just a byproduct. You can be happy with nothing, and you can manifest tons and give back tons too. The second thing is the idea that like you want to do the 50 triathlons, you start training. Over
Mm-hmm.
time, you're going to get to that goal if you keep with consistency. But if you can give yourself something, a worthy goal that gives you a lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
right? That you're willing to work. The master in China that could break stone
Mm-hmm.
spent years in meditation and
Mm-hmm.
hard qigong, poking a tree to do something that was impossible. So what if that goal of what your possibility was so inspiring to you, it just kind of unfolded as you went along? It's not about just like, oh, I'm going to go manifest this. It's like, I really want to, because it's who I am. It's a part of my being. It's my connection with nature. And I think if you can line those things up, we must manifest the thing that we want. Even if it's the house and the family, you might get it 30, 40, 50. It's like, oh, but that's a part of this whole bigger picture that I'm embodying. So that was a huge story. You can feel free to add on and comment as you wish. But it goes back to the question that I wanted to ask originally, and I'm very curious about, is I think that everybody has limitless potential. I think that anybody can create and live an absolutely extraordinary life. But we're kind of misdirected in our thinking and time frames and convoluted, that we're not able to give ourselves a clear picture of something that would be meaningful to work at for a long period of time, because that's probably what's going to be required. But through your mastery, you might get to the point where you can friggin' do a triathlon for 50 days in a row. That is unbelievable, right? But it would have taken you a while to get to that first one. You know what I mean? And better and better and better at whatever that next manifestation version or creation of what you would like to bring forth, what you'd like to manifest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Those are cool stories. I have a couple of thoughts kind of going back to the beginning. One, being around people that are spiritually advanced. I don't, who knows, enlightened or not enlightened, whatever, but people that have had those experiences, there is something that gets transmitted, spirit to spirit or consciousness to consciousness. And it gets talked about in the Tibetan tradition as like a pointing out instruction. And I've had that experience with a few teachers where it's like, you just get zapped, like, I think it feels different for different people, but it's like you're zapped by lightning or something. And you're having this experience, but it's not really of your own volition. It's kind of like you're tasting their experience a little bit, like being around, if you ever get a chance to, actually physically meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that without a doubt, I mean, for me, many, many times that came through. So yes, I think that's very real. And I think the more time you spend with those kind of people, the more that rubs off on you. There's a saying in India, and it says that even an ordinary tree growing in a sandalwood forest, because sandalwood smells quite good, will pick up the scent of sandalwood. And so it's like they're saying, seek out those kinds of people, because it'll permeate onto you. And then the other thing I was thinking about while you were talking was, quote unquote religion and religious people, and that creates so many issues, I think, for many people, because you can look back at history and say, oh, the institution and all of this. And I'm reminded of the saying that it says, mystics agree, but theologians argue. And so it's this idea that, you can talk about, is God, 6 foot tall with a long beard sitting up in heaven, or is God over here? Is God this? But if you're talking, in my experience, if I talk to like a Christian mystic or a Jewish mystic or, a Sufi, it's very, very similar to a lot of the discussion around Buddhist philosophy. I mean, Buddhist mysticism, right? And even if you don't have access to those people, pick up a copy of Rumi, right? Pick up Rumi's poems, and then pick up like a Zen book or a Tibetan book, one that's written not on philosophy, just like from the heart. And you will definitely be able to find these connections. And I think people innately sense that, and they don't want to get caught up in a system that's going to be limiting in some way. And so it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because of that, they don't commit fully to one system, and right, understandably, but then they also can kind of limit their own progress, because they're like going here, going there, doing all these different things. Whereas if you just stuck with the one thing, you would have accomplished all. But it's hard to do, I think, because I see the drawbacks in that. And then, now I lost my train of thought. We're going to talk about manifesting. What was the last, what was your last point about manifesting?
I don't. Oh, well, I like the idea of like giving yourself a lifetime to work.
Oh yeah,
for something.
right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, the idea, if you're going back to like law of attraction and even like a spiritual understanding of manifesting something, let's say you just want money, you want more money, easy, right? Measurable, like you said.
Everybody.
If you really want to, yeah, exactly, very measurable. if you only stay with that, it's going to take much longer than if you find out what the feeling is behind you having a lot of money. So if you really want to talk about like how to actually do this, and this is funny because I'll tell you just really quickly about some of my clients in a second. What you need to do is so if I think about, okay, having a lot of money, having abundance, what that does is it gives me a feeling of freedom, right? Me personally, it might give you a feeling of satisfaction or safety or power, whatever that feeling is. But so for me, it's freedom. And so when I am trying to manifest something, trying to create something, or trying to attract something, however you want to think about that, you have to stand in the place of that quality, that core value, that emotional charge, that feeling, in order to bring that to you. Otherwise, you don't have the juice. It's like you don't have the battery to light up the light, right? But if you do have that energy to light up the light, much faster, and you can get those things. And it's funny, the reason I brought up my clients is I do executive coaching and career coaching, and for my career coaching clients, it is unbelievable. So what I have them do is I have them identify the exact career that they're looking for. Not like I want to be a project manager at Google, but like I want to work with innovative people. I want to be engaging with inspiring conversations. I want to be making X dollars. And so sometimes it's like, it takes me 2 sessions to get them to say like, I want $90,000. Other times it takes me 2 sessions for them to get to, I want $250,000. I have one client, was making $500,000. He wanted to make $750 million. Everybody has their limit of what it is. You know, it's all in the mind. And it's like, the more we can push yourself and get to that point, the better you're going to be in terms of creating that reality. Now, the reason I bring that up is because every single client that I've had that does this practice, and what I have them do is either create a vision board or create a list or email themselves, whatever it is. If they do the practice right, unbelievable. Like within a few months, they get exactly what they're looking for, like down to the $1,000 amount. And that's where it's like, it's completely impressive to me that they're able to create that within their life.
That's amazing. And I totally agree, because when I'm working with clients, it's the same thing. And these practices and these principles have been around. They're just not popularized. And again, it's not physical. So many people have such resistance to using them. But like, that's why I use a sport example so often. It's because the sport is a physical manifestation of what the body is capable of, how fast we can go, how strong we can be. And it all starts in the mind. And when you are a martial artist as a kid, you understand that's what it is. It's mind, body. But then that's how the spiritual experience comes in, you know, and that's where it goes beyond you. You realize that you are a part of everything, that this is a very special experience to be having. And if you're in that and you're fulfilled and you're doing well, you're naturally going to want to support other people. So your highest vision, whatever that is, that's amazing. That's what the universe wants for you. That's what the environment wants for you. And that's how you're going to be able to give back to other people. So I'm curious with that process, if someone's listening, can you just give like the Cole's notes? Is it like a visualization that they'll do once they get really clear, like going through a process, getting very clear, and then adding a visualization as a part of the practice?
Yeah, actually, it's pretty simple. If I'm doing that kind of stuff, like law of attraction, we'll call it that. The first thing is getting a clear vision around how you want to feel within that. And so, not like I said, I strongly discourage people from saying like, I want to be a project manager at Apple or whatever, because you don't actually know what the universe has in store for the possibilities for you to actually feel as successful as you want to feel. It may be in a totally different direction. You know, you may end up being an author and going on Oprah. Who knows what that's going to look like. So one, getting a clear set of what it is that you want to actually bring forth. But being very specific about, you know, the actual dollar amount, I think that's important, and trying to stretch that up, trying to push that up as much as you can. Then identifying the core feelings around that. Like, okay, I will feel creative, I will feel inspired, and I will feel free. Let's say it's like that. And then I have them actually create that feeling, like close your eyes, you know, while we're on the phone or on a Zoom meeting, and imagine what that feels like, and try to step into that feeling. And where is it located in your body? And see if you can increase that, like turn the dial up and let that permeate all of your cells. And then from that point, you can read the email that you wrote to yourself, or look at your vision board, or visualize if you're inclined toward that. You know, those things, reading an email that you've sent to yourself of affirmations or putting up a vision board, those are just visualization tools, right? It triggers something within our mind to be able to do that. So if you're skilled at visualization, you don't even need to do it. And you just imagine that happening. And then you have to kind of rinse and repeat. So that you have to, for my clients, I tell them you have to do it every single day. And for the first week, I want them to check in with me. Like, did you do it today? And if not, why not? And what's getting lost there? So that's really the formula, and it's pretty simple, and it has these amazing results.
Well, I figured out at the end why it works for your clients, because you force the accountability. And that's the challenge when we're doing this type of work. It gets to the point sometimes where you don't know if it's working because you can't feel it, and we want it so immediately, so we just give up. And for me, for whatever reason, I've just been very curious about this stuff, so I kind of go all in. And then it's that point when you do it, you see the result, and if you're journaling it, if you're writing it down, if you're asking questions, you're going to be able to measure it and be like, oh smokes, you know what I mean? That's how it came. Like, it actually did work. So it's up to each individual to find their own proof and to have the resolve to do it consistently, to follow through a process, to really commit to experiment, because it's really not that much time, but there's enough information out there to give us enough reason to add it as a part of our practice. And even in the very sense of just how we live and navigate our lives, because many people live in what I've kind of referred to as like default mode or taskless consciousness, where we get up and, you could be making a lot of money, you could be making no money, it doesn't matter. But it's like like the elections coming up in Canada, so many people are, on the elections, and that's important to them, and that's totally fine. But it's just like, what does that other person mean to your own freedom, to the quality of life, to what choices you have each and every day? Do you wake up and you are inspired about what you do? You've designed your life from A to B. What your values are, and you're executing on your values. Or are you kind of in this space where you're just getting by and life is hard, and you're depressed and all those things? And that's a lot of people. That's even me sometimes. That's me currently sometimes. But at least I have a vision, and I'm moving towards something that's super inspiring. And for the most part, it's pretty good. And I know that there's room for lots of improvement, but it's the idea of doing something meaningful, at least in my own life. And there's a lot of things that I have control of that many people don't. And I see that the sense of their frustration. Maybe they can't control their time. They're showing up. Like, where does your body show up? I actually just did a coaching call with a person, and it was so funny. He said that he had this experience where he had a vision of himself at his computer. He was doing finances, and it showed the past 5 years of his life, or whatever time frame it was, and it removed the computer. And he had realized at this moment that he had been doing nothing at all. Nobody had ever thanked him. He'd not done anything grateful. He just saw the 5 years flash in banking and just removed the computer. And he had realized he was just sitting at a chair staring at a screen. And that was his life. And some people just like kind of live on the beach. Some people snowboard. Some people explore nature. Some people do all these different versions of being alive, of being human, having the human experience. Designing your life is so far beyond just your job. But in Buddhism and Zen, and I think a lot of the concepts people talk about is your vocation. That's more about like, who are you? What do you want to learn? What are you good at? Maybe you're a swordsmith. Maybe you're an artist. Maybe you're a tech guy because you just love it, and that's who you are, and you're fully immersed in there. But that's your vocation. It's you expressing as yourself, and then the job manifests around that.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And I think you're right to point out kind of the repetition, the training aspect, I think, is where a lot of people fall down, especially if they don't have a coach and you don't see these immediate results, and they're kind of like on the fence, like, this is some woo stuff. Does it work? And I think in my experience, where people fall down is either not having enough juice behind it, not having enough emotional or spiritual power behind it, or not doing it long enough, like not finding a way to structure it so that it's not even a choice. It's like, that's something you do, right? Like I don't wake up and choose to brush my teeth. I just wake up and I'm brushing my teeth. So it's that kind of practice. And creating your life and a vocation, it's very often that the world needs exactly what you most want to give. And I think that that's easy to forget when we get caught up in the rat race of daily life. It's easy. I mean, it's easy. I forget it all the time too, even though I'm, helping coaching people with that. And the more we can go back to that by actually stepping into the qualities that we most want to manifest. And this goes back to, like, let's say around money or around your career, it's like joy. Okay, I'm thinking about that and I get a sense of joy. The more you can actually live in joy at the moment, the easier and the faster that actual outside thing is going to manifest. It's just our world is only a reflection of our internal situation, our internal reality. And so it's kind of almost ironic that the thing that you're hoping to give you joy is really only going to come when you find a way to stand in your own joy at the moment. And that's the training.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's challenging. Again, a lot easier said than done, but I find it to be very, very true. And, you know, I'm just kind of reminded of a good friend, Adam Poole. I have to tell him I mentioned him on the podcast, but he grew up a farmer and he had this crazy work ethic, but he picked up a computer at like 18 and he's doing incredibly well. And like, he's worked for, you know, the Super Bowl and the biggest big things. And he could like do the graphics and he could animate it and he could just do all this stuff. But I'll tell you characteristics about this person. He's the most giving person I've ever met. He just is always giving. When we were in Whistler, he'd be hooking up everybody's computer, getting them soft, just because we didn't know what we were doing. He would always be doing that and he would never complain. This guy, that was another facet. He'd never complain, and he just would have this idea, this work ethic, this appreciation, and just always giving back. And to see him receive it just like makes so much sense. And I'm so happy for him because he's such a good guy and the most deserving. But some of those elements, you know, like just consistency, appreciation, and just being it. And so, you know, there's the example too of Jim Carrey where he talked about, you know, getting paid $1 million for his acting skills and feeling that. And there's story after story. The same with, you know, that's one idea, but the way that it manifests physically too, with people who are doing like high dives or Olympic high diving, they spend a lot of time in visualization. The more complicated the move, the more difficult the task, the more time in visualization. And it's the exact same time with whatever you're trying to manifest in your reality, using that as a part of the process, because there's so much information about why that works now. You can go find it, but you really got to get yourself into the practice just to get a little taste, a universal wink where you're like, oh, you know what? This actually does work. And it's, you know, it's part of my daily process. I'd say it's like visualization is like the squats. As a species, we all want strong legs. Somebody figured out that you just do squats every now and then, you know, like squats with weights. And now some people are going around with super strong legs, you know what I mean? I have distance, and some of us aren't, but it's just like, I've been telling you, bro, you got to squat. You know what I mean? But why would, I don't understand why I would just put something heavy on my back and then stand up. It doesn't make any sense. You got to try it to have the experience.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing. Confidence breeds more success. So whatever needs to happen to have people confident in the process, and whether it's, you know, a small little test or whatever, then, you know, that's the thing to do to move them forward. But so, you know, I think it's a bit different if you're working with a coach, you're paying for the privilege of that, right? It's like, look, I'm going to keep you on the straight and narrow. Whether you believe it or not, it doesn't really matter. Like, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it for the next 3 months, and let's see what happens, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%, man. Well, man, all of this has been such a fantastic insight. I've really enjoyed the conversation with you. I want to ask, is there anything that you wish that I had asked, or is there anything that you want to discuss before we finish for today?
No, this has been great. I really appreciate it. Love hearing a little bit more about your background, and would love to come on again sometime in the future. That'd be great.
Yeah, man. Sounds good to me. Well, so I'm just going to throw a random question at you then, because again, I really enjoyed this conversation. I talk more than I usually did, so apologies to my audience if you wanted Nick to speak more, but I really enjoyed this, man. You really know what you're talking about. You're an expert, humble, and putting out really good information. What would you offer to people who like are struggling right now? Like, for everything that you've kind of learned, you know, what would you like to say around like just helping an individual find their own path, their own empowerment if they're in a little bit of a rough spot? And then also just, I'd be curious about, your thoughts on how we could move toward world peace, because I want to discuss that more on the podcast,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's so important. I think it's something that is possible within our lifetime. I
Mm-hmm.
think that religions have played a huge part in why we've had war on the planet, because they're killing over their beliefs. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really what's happening, is we're having these massive wars, whether it's nationalities or beliefs in gods or different things. Individuals don't want to go and murder each other, but as a species now, we should be ready to at least solve our problems without
Mm-hmm.
guns, without bombs. And I feel like that's such a critical point in human history. Like, we look back and say, in 2020 we ended war, in 2021 we stopped warring with each other. If
Mm-hmm.
we're an intelligent species, I feel like that's important. And from the research I've done, not if you're religious, I have still tons of love and respect for you and in your belief, but it does seem those institutions battling each other's, if you look back in time, are where these wars were stemming from, and still continue to have a huge influence. We need to cultivate a belief, but also tolerance in someone else's view as well. So
Mm-hmm.
you being studied in that, I'd be curious to your opinion.
Yeah, that's a big question. We'll go into the first part of what would I offer somebody struggling. And I mean, you know, I've certainly had times in my life that have been difficult, that I've struggled through, regardless of any amount of meditation experience. And maybe it does give you, I know it does give you a certain kind of strength to be able to see things in a different way and to be able to move through it maybe more effortlessly than otherwise. But even if you don't have that background, I think that there are two things that have really helped me. One is trying to frame something in the positive. And the way that I look at that is like what we were talking about early on, like, what is the learning here from me? Like, this is a really painful, really crappy experience. It feels really out of control. I can think of myself as a victim even, or I could turn this around and say, this is an amazing training ground. I'm in this simulation called life. And what is it that I'm meant to learn here? And how can I learn that even faster by leaning into it? That's the first thing. And then the other thing is just, sometimes for me, it's like the frustration or any anger, any kind of like quote unquote negative emotions, they come from wanting something to be other than it is, instead of really letting go and just experiencing the moment of what's going on. Whatever the big problem is, like what's going on right now. What does the seat feel like? What does the air smell like? That kind of thing. And just staying present with it. And those two things can really help get you through some rocky patches. But I know it's not easy, even for if somebody's had training. And then to your other point about world peace, I know that there are many conflicts, wars, battles, conflicts that are in the name of religion or in the name of ideology or in the name of this or that. From my perspective, every single war or conflict actually arises over a scarcity of resources. So there's one group that has a scarcity of resources and another group that doesn't, and that creates this tension between the two. So if you look at Arab nations and the modern West, right? Extremely low. There's a huge gap in terms of the GDP relative to how many people there are. So it creates this tension of like, oh, they have and we don't, and how do we get some? And then there's this an ideology that builds up around that. Well, actually, they have that stuff, but they're infidels. Or on the American side, on the Western side, it's like, well, they have that stuff, but they're in the Stone Ages. Or they don't have that stuff, it's because they're in the Stone Ages with their thinking and Sharia law and all that. And so what we do is we use those frameworks in order to vilify or create more distance between the two groups, right? We're in the in group when they're in the out group, the haves and have-nots. And so I think it's very rare for a culture that is thriving to go out and make war on another culture that's also thriving. That's usually not what happens, almost never. And so if you can kind of create a more level playing field, and I'm not saying like total equality, I don't think that's actually even possible, but just a more level playing field, I think you're going to take away some of the root cause. But then on the deeper level, the more you connect with your own inner peace, which I almost hate saying that term, but like an inner sense of quality where you're calm or you're loving or you're compassionate, those positive qualities, much harder to have that person on an individual level go out and like shoot somebody down with a drone or whatever it is. So I think that as these tools become more useful and used within society and not necessarily attached to an ideology. I think that actually is a key to move forward. And the Dalai Lama talks about this a lot, that inner peace creates outer peace. And it goes along with what we've been talking about this whole time, that the inner qualities that you most have access to are the very things that are going to orient and organize your experience of the world. And it seems like magic, and it kind of is.
Beautifully stated, man. Love that insight. I love that idea. And I agree, just, from my own experience of just, being up a man. I use the example, when you're a teenager, if somebody calls you a loser, you got to go fight them because you
Right.
don't know how to handle those emotions. And over
Yeah.
time, when you become more whole and more
Mm-hmm.
understanding of how your mind works and emotions and things like that, when you're okay with yourself and you're comfortable with yourself and you're whole and balanced, it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter what somebody's saying to me. Might irritate me, but at once you get to a certain level, it's not going to irritate you at all because you realize that has
Mm-hmm.
nothing to do with you, and
Right.
you're not attached to that idea. So, if we could create that culturally, if we can create, abundance and freedom and support for the entire world, I'd like to just give the example of Team Earth. What if
Mm-hmm.
aliens are looking down and they look at this planet and we're so battling, and so we're all basically the same, and
Mm-hmm.
just like, let's be more tolerant, let's be more kind, and let's create energy for all, let's create basic living for all, let's work together. Team
Mm-hmm.
Canada versus with Team USA, with Team Russia, with Team China, everybody working together, to just create abundance for all. It sounds simple to me. I feel like it makes sense. I don't know why there's so much red tape towards that.
Yeah.
I'm not in politics, I'm not in the UN. I'm just like, start working together, start talking to each other, let's get in, like you said, the high level mystics and the high level, spiritual leaders in different things, they're going to talk to the
Mm-hmm.
other leader. You know what I mean? Unless some of them have an agenda, then that might be a little bit of a different thing.
Right.
But that's the idea, is like, we need to be talking to each other. We need to be tolerant, and we need to be having these discussions, because as a human species that's supposed to be intelligent, that we can go to the moon. Some people believe we didn't go to the moon. That's your own thing. I don't know. Well, I think we did.
Yeah.
That's a whole Joe Rogan side note. But we should be able to be peaceful, and we
Yeah.
should be looking after each other, and we should be doing a better job of how we take care of each other on this planet, and just discussing those things. So anyway, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate you and your work and what you're doing. Where can people find more about you if they want to grab the book, if they want to look at your work? Where do they go?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Matt. It's been great. I really appreciate the conversation. Best way to find the book is Amazon, Shift, The Art of Transforming Limitations. You can find it also Target online, Barnes & Noble, places like that. Best way to connect with me personally is either through LinkedIn or my website is nickeganphd.com. You can shoot me a message over there. I respond within 24 to 48 hours.
Right on. Well, thanks for coming on the show, man. I appreciate the kind words and the conversation. Also, we'll definitely get you back on the show, and we'll stay in touch. So thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you. Take care.
Peace.